Welcome back, ladies and gents. You are watching and or listening to the NTC podcast. I'm Aaron Washington. My co-host John is back on for a great recording today. And then on this installment of the NTC podcast, we want to welcome in the one and only Mark Schindler, everybody. Mark is a fellow SBC alumni, and he is currently producing some great work over at basketballnews.com. So I have a little phrase or like a hashtag, if you will, on Twitter kind of going around right now. Always read Mark, guys. If you see something go out that Mark puts on Basketball News, be sure to give it a read. It's definitely going to be worth your time. But Mark, just want to say, you've been producing some great work online. Want to just congratulate you on what you've been doing here so far, and just welcoming you onto the show. It's great to have you, and we're really looking forward to this conversation here this evening. So, hope you're doing well, man, and we're glad to have you in the studio.
Yeah, I appreciate that a ton, man. I was really looking forward to this. I'm glad to catch up again. It's been a minute, so we're in the middle of the playoffs, and it somehow feels like not even close to being done with it. But
Right.
it's been a whirlwind of a year, man. So yeah, we have a lot to get into.
Absolutely, 100%. So to kind of kick this off, let's call this an icebreaker, if you will, Mark, to kind of get you up to speed or indoctrinated into this podcast, however you want to put it. But just want to ask you about your experience here so far with Basketball News. Now you've been with them for not too long now, but you've produced some articles about just kind of a bunch of different things: offensive, defensive, player centric, team centric, kind of all over the map. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you go about kind of deciding what you want to write about? Is it kind of just totally up to you? And what have been your general takeaways from being a contributor for Basketball News here so far?
Yeah, well, I've loved it. I didn't really know. I mean, like I was decent friends with Nikias Duncan before I joined on there, but I didn't really know the staff super well. I didn't know Spencer Davies or Alex Kennedy that great, and they were both. I mean, they're the two lead editors there. Alex is the one who started up everything, and they're awesome. Like, so I think that first and foremost, like I mean, I'm pretty good at knowing people in the basketball community, but getting to know them has been really great, and they've helped me in a lot of ways. I mean, I got more into feature writing this year, and just trying to get to more well-rounded stuff. Like I mean, as long as I've known you, Aaron, I've always been doing like more analysis, breaking things down that way. But I got into some more opinion-based things this year, and also like I mentioned, doing more features. So that's been really cool because actually having more of a brand that you can be backed with that does have real viable credibility has allowed me to do more like that, which has been really cool.
Sure.
I've been pretty lucky with how things have worked out. I mean, this was my first year of really doing things full time, and I've been just lucky in how things have broken for me. I mean, to be fair, I also did I did a lot of work part time over the last 2-3 years to get to where I'm at. But yeah, feeling pretty good for 24, man. So we're making it work. But no, it's cool. I mean, I honestly get pretty much like I can do just about anything, which is a great part because I know from working at other places it does not work like that always. So having kind of real autonomy to work on what I really want to is awesome. Like it really kind of opens the door for me to be as creative as I want. I mean, most of these nights going into when I have a deadline the next day, there are times when I'm working on like a bigger project or something that I have known that I want to write on for a while, and I finally have some time to that I'll go in with that. But even like just the last month or so, with the way that the stakes have shook out, I mean, I'll kind of go into a night just hope that something catches my eye, and if not, I'll have something in the tank ready to go for tomorrow. But if not, I'll just wake up early in the morning and I'll bang something out that stood out in the night before. So yeah, I think that's been like one of the biggest changes up for me. Like I went from writing once or twice a week to now it's kind of just like if I'm not writing in a day, I don't know what's going on. I write I'm pretty steadily around like 8 to 10,000 words a week, so it's just kind of not meant as like a flex, but it's just kind of like you go from like it used to take me 2 weeks to write something that was 1,500 words, and now I just need 2 hours. So it kind of depends on the day. But yeah, no, I think that's been the biggest part about becoming a more full-time writer, or not more, like I definitely full-time now, but yeah, those have definitely been the biggest changes up working at Basketball News for sure.
Sweet, man. That's fantastic. We love to hear that. And we love to hear that, SBC has kind of propelled you to an opportunity as it is for a lot of us here at No Trade Clause. So, that's always encouraging. And, we're going to have a plug at the end of this podcast. We love to plug SBC. We do it at every episode, and we're definitely going to save some time at the end to kind of address that. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead, guys, and dive into some of the subject matters for this podcast, which we're going to be leading off with a couple of teams that have recently found themselves out of the playoffs. They have been eliminated as of this recording. The first of which being the Atlanta Hawks. We got to start with Trey Young. He is the big driver, the engine of this team. He has been since he stepped into the league a few years ago, and now he came to grips with difficult reality, which was that certain playoff defenses are a whole different breed. When you get into the postseason and you're facing a team like Miami, it's a different animal. Miami had several really potent defenders to throw at Trey, and it kind of threw him off his game to the point where he was saying that he hadn't seen defenses like that or guard him in that manner since he was in high school, which is really saying something, and credit to the Heat defense. So taking this to a more broader view, looking at their offseason, I mean, Trey Young, is finishing up his rookie scale deal. So now going into this offseason, he is entering the first year of a 5-year, $207 million contract extension. So just to put that in perspective, I mean, he was, under 10 million this past season as far as the salary. Now he's going to jump all the way up to 30.5 million to start next season. So definitely a nice chunk of change here for him that's coming up. But Mark, I wanted to throw this to your direction here real quick, if you don't mind. Just looking at the Hawks offseason, their situation, with Trey Young coming up on his extension. And speaking of extensions, Kevin Huerter is also his is also kicking in. He has a 5-year deal that's coming up here in the offseason. What are a few needs or a few things that stood out to you for Atlanta that really got exposed in that series against the Heat that you think they need to address in free agency, to not only help Trey Young with him getting back to his normal self, but getting that team as a whole back to a place where they're competing for a conference championship as they were just a year ago?
Yeah, I think to get the best picture of this team, I think you have to go backwards a little bit too. Obviously, they make the conference finals last year. I think people can discredit that to whatever degree they want to. I still think, regardless, that was a really talented team. They hit the right spot. They clearly, I picked them to be. I think I had them finishing my final preseason prediction was between the 1 and 4 seed this year. That did not happen. Obviously, injuries played a big part in that, but also just stagnancy as a team. Their offense really, they found their groove later on in the year, but early in the year, they just looked like a shell of themselves on both ends. And I think that's where you can look and say the defense needs to be a lot better. Obviously, I think, there's always going to be some limitations with Trey. I do think they have been a little bit overblown, in my opinion. I think more of the issues with their defense this year was about who else is on the roster and what they weren't able to do or weren't doing, rather than, this all being on Trey. I think he definitely stresses the defense more. It's taking away some of the suspension cables on a bridge, but the bridge still sucked. So that's just kind of what I thought with him. Clint Capella wasn't right for most of the year, in my opinion. I thought he really didn't look like himself until the last couple months of the season. He was really up and down, even along those lines too. That was definitely a big hit for them because he played a borderline defensive player of the year candidate most of last year, especially after Nate McMillan took over, which was a large reason for why they played pretty solid defense in the playoffs and down the stretch. I think you can also counter too, they had Cam Reddish last year was a solid defensive player for them, even, given some of his, well, no, he didn't even play that much last year. What am I talking about? But DeAndre Hunter never really got into a rhythm this year. I think, he still has some real ball holding tendencies on offense, but it's more about defensively. I'm not really sure what they're doing with him at times. There were multiple points this season where he was getting used like a big at times, where he would drop on ball screens and just do a lot of funky stuff that didn't really make sense for why he was drafted and what the purpose of him as a player is. Right. I think they rectified some of that as the year went on, but still, he's the guy to me. They have to figure out what's going on with him next year, how to get him into better situations on both ends of the court, how to better optimize him when he's out there, because, for a guy that I don't believe they traded up to take him, but I mean, still taking him in the top 5 of the draft, you need to have a better return than this. Just considering this team is past the point of being a rebuilding team. These are the guys you have, at least for now, or at least, even then, like, these are the guys you have now, or, whatever their value ends up being over the next year or two, that's what you're able to work with. So right now, I mean, I don't imagine that DeAndre Hunter would have awesome value around the league, at least compared to what it looked like, December of last year before he got injured. Which is what makes it all the more frustrating too, because he's had like really bright flashes and looked pretty darn good too. It's just about consistency and putting it together. To add on to, like, Bogdan Bogdanović was not himself for a lot of the year. He looked really good down the stretch, but again, he's going to be 30 next year. Danilo Gallinari took another step back this season, had some really hot moments, but he's getting to a stage even more now where, like, he's gone from you can live with him on defense to he's kind of getting to liability territory. Lou Williams really took a step back. Like, I think the biggest thing that I took away from this last season is just how difficult it is to continue a really good bench. Like, it's not like, I mean, yes, guys took steps back, but also there was just like, I mean, after being on the bench for 1 year, I think a lot of people forget how human it is. Like, these guys don't necessarily, like, they view themselves as wanting to maximize who they are and what they can do. Like, looking at stuff with Cam Reddish, like Chris Kirshner from The Athletic had an article today on the Hawks end of the season and mentioned, like, there was no organizational mandate for Cam Reddish to be played, but Nate McMillan was playing him anyways because he didn't want to, further harm the vibes of the team, for lack of better words, and not remembering the quote. But like, obviously that did not work out. But that's stuff that plays in. Not everyone is content to be a bench player in the NBA. So finding that balance was something, like, I think that's, again, like, you can look backwards and say, maybe they should have made a more bold move in the offseason, which, hindsight's 2020. But yeah, so the long story short, they need to really up their top end talent alongside Trey, because who is the second best player on this team? Like, most of the time it's John Collins, in my opinion, but obviously he missed a lot of time this year, was kind of in and out. But yeah, having better wing defense and just having saying smarter offense around him is not the right way to put it, but having better connective players around him, because for a player who is going to be so ball dominant, which that's another thing we can get into for sure, but I think you could really see how detrimental it was to have guys who weren't always capable of capitalizing on what Trey was able to do, or even getting going when he wasn't able to.
Do you think DeAndre Hunter can be that second star next to Trey Young? Because he'll be extension eligible this year up until the day before the start of the season, and then next year he'll be a restricted free agent. So I mean, what do you think they should do there?
In terms of star, like, I don't know about star. Like, I think DeAndre could be a really nice starter in the NBA. I don't know if I'd see, like, I mean, given, you can go back to last year, and I think if you look at just in the vacuum of last year, like, he looked like a guy who was budding as an all-star eventually. And I don't think that we're that far away from it. But I think the thing is just more, can he stay on the court for a whole season is my thing. Like,
that's the question.
I mean, it's kind of like, again, not to like conflate it to another situation, but it's like TJ Warren when he was in Phoenix. Like, I think TJ Warren played more than 60 games once when he was in Phoenix. And obviously we saw how good he was when he was able to play a full season in Indiana, but then he gets injured again. And I think I'm kind of in that same point with DeAndre Hunter, because I know there were injury concerns about him coming out of Virginia too. And it just really makes you question and wonder, can he be a guy who was capable of being on the court all the time? But that being said, like, if you're able to erase that or just like look, without that, I think if he is able, and I mean, he mentioned in his exit interview that he really wants to focus on ball handling, which I think is definitely something he needs to work on, because part of the issue right now is like, ideally, like, the idea of DeAndre Hunter is somebody who is a 3 for you, but he's a 4 offensively. Like, he is not a great passer. He's not a great decision maker. His handle isn't really there to take on better wings. So, like, they need him to be able to develop into playing as more of a 3 and just developing some of the things that allow him to be more of a threat in the offense outside of just getting a shot off from the mid range. So I do think that's definitely possible for him. I wouldn't necessarily call it low hanging fruit, but I mean, just being on the court for 80 games would be a market improvement for him.
Absolutely. Mark, you're discussing these guys like Gallinari and DeAndre Hunter, these guys that they have at the wing position. And, I get to looking at them in addition to Gallinari, and I'm a little bit concerned about their depth at those spots. When they went to Gallinari, like you said, they had a lot of problems hanging with some of those forwards in the league. Actually, a lot of them, because you think of the skill sets of these guys now, it's a lot of floor spacing. A lot of these guys have the skills to be pretty decent ball handlers, pretty decent, offensive players in more ways than one. And, Gallinari does have an expiring deal. Only $5 million is guaranteed for next season. So if they cut him by June 29th, they could move on from him and free up that salary. Not that it would help all that much, because Trey Young's extension kicks in. So they're still going to be up there in terms of being over the cap and close to the luxury tax. But they do have some good mid-sized salaries that they could combine if they wanted to make a deal, as well as all their first-round picks. So it gets me thinking, if somebody does become available, which, we say that all the time, but it doesn't happen all that often. But they do have avenues to pursue, what people say is that what Trey needs, which is a secondary star next to him, or somebody that can take some of that pressure off of him in the big moments. So they do have avenues to upgrade their roster. So I guess they can take that into the offseason. They do have some hope on that front when it comes to their assets. They are pretty asset heavy. And then, you look at some of their guys coming off the books. Delon Wright is an unrestricted free agent. Kevin Knox is a restricted free agent. And then they do have 2 first-round picks coming up, or actually 1 first-round pick and 1 second. So, they have assets. It's just all about whether they want to kind of push all their chips in, which at this point they might be tempted to do, because you do have a guy like Trey Young, which he didn't show it in that past series against Miami, but he is one of the bigger stars in our league. So the opportunity is there for Atlanta if they want to make a deal. It's just all about whether they think that's a viable option at this juncture.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think the bigger thing too that I just want to see in general that I'm not sure we are going to see with Trey. I do think that he deserves some criticism for the series, but I think it's been a little bit heavy-handed. Can he be a player that can do more without the ball in his hands? That's been a thing for him since he was in high school. So if I'm being honest, I'm not really projecting that out for him. And that's not to take away from him. I thought that I'm trying to remember. I think I had him first team All NBA this year, and I wouldn't retract that based on what happened in the playoffs. It's a regular season award, get over it. It is a very real thing. If you do bring in a secondary star, okay, well, can you even just bring Trey off the pin downs, do stuff like that? Can you do anything that is getting him involved outside of just being kind of like what we see with James Harden at times, just standing off on the wing? It's not impacting the defense. Right. And I think if he's, especially for a guy who is this is where I come in with his defense. I would say I'm not as down on, building a defense around him as I think others are, but I do think if you're going to be a team that has Trey Young, you have to find a way to get him to become that guy who is a really good off-ball player, or at least is attempting to become that guy, because you have to really excel in the margins if you're going to be, a little bit more of a non-traditional, I guess at least where the modern NBA is going, being more of a smaller guard. Even looking at Darius Garland, obviously not the same player as Trey Young, not the level of player that Trey is yet, but he really took major steps as an off-ball player this last year or two. And well, yes, they got ousted before the playoffs. A lot of that had to do with injuries and everything, obviously, but can you just do that? Can you become a guy who becomes better as a mover off the ball? So I'm interested to see what that looks like. And granted, he took a massive leap this year as an individual scorer and player, so I don't think it's off the table for him, but definitely stuff to look forward to.
100%. While you're discussing stagnation in offensive sets, I feel like that's a great segue into our next team that we're going to discuss. And boy, can we spend a lot of time on this team.
Yeah.
The takes have been flying fast and furious. Everybody's taking heat right now. Steve Nash, they're calling for his resignation, for him to be fired. Ben Simmons. We can go on and on. I don't want to get into a first take type scenario where debating where we debate or whether or not Kyrie should have, been playing earlier in the season. Don't want to do all that. Really just kind of want to take a view, kind of like what we did with the Hawks, and look at where they could go from this point on. And Mark, this is where I'm really glad you're on board, because, at No Trade Clubs, we specialize in the business side of the sport. So we look at contracts, we look at where teams stand from a financial standpoint, but you are really good when it comes to the on-court aspect of basketball, the X's and O's, the analysis, just really getting down and dirty with this stuff. So I wanted to start with Kevin Durant. From a financial perspective, first off, I mean, he did sign that extension back in August, which is for 4 years, 198. So he's signed on long-term with this team. He's not looking to move. He's not looking to kind of change up his career path. I mean, it looks like he's set on this team and he's committed to playing with Kyrie and making this thing work. That being said, they are coming off of a playoff series where some certain things were exposed, some certain weaknesses of this team. And I'm sure you've been watching this team very closely, and those have been apparent to you. But what stood out to me first, and John, I want to get your opinions on this as well. KD is a little bit different from a guy like LeBron James. I've seen that comparison come up a little bit here. Just in terms of, what can he do when the pressure's on him, when defenses are zoned in on him. And, obviously, it's a little bit different from when he was in Golden State. And Mark, I'm sure you've seen this. You see that snapshot of KD in Golden State where he's on the left side of the court, left wing, and Curry is on the right wing, and everyone's just pushed to the one side of the court. So he's not getting the same type of looks as he did when he was playing with Curry and Clay. But, John, what stood out to you when you were, I know you didn't get to see all the games here, but looking at KD try to go against this Boston defense, I mean, was he just, did he sell this series, or do you feel like, it was just a product of him not having the right pieces around him to get off those looks and have a better performance in terms of his efficiency?
Yeah, even though I was coaching in Greece last week, I couldn't help but stay up at 4 a.m. and watch some of these games and see what was going on with these Nets because, it's been so polarized.
That's dedication right there, man. I love it.
It was a big series, a lot of eyeballs, right? And it really, when it comes to that, when we started talking about kind of LeBron and KD, what the biggest difference is, I would say the biggest difference between the two of them might be LeBron's playmaking in those situations. That'd probably be the answer to that. But in terms of KD and getting those looks, the chemistry is huge. We kind of really undervalue that in the NBA. Being that, because obviously these players are so talented and they can do so much by themselves. But at the end of the day, though, chemistry is super important. And the Nets just didn't have a lot of that. They didn't get to play with each other that much. There's all those stats about how few games or minutes they played all together or with different starting lineups. And a lot of teams faced that this year in different ways. But for them, so much of what made them really good was their supposed really good spacing. And because of that lack of chemistry, they weren't able to use that to their fullest. Like last year, I feel like even though they still had some problems last year getting on the court altogether. In like that Bucks series, for example, especially those first few games when KD when Kyrie and Harden were both healthy, the ball was just flying all over the place and their spacing was incredible. This year, obviously, credit to Boston for limiting that, especially, but it just wasn't there in the same way. Due to their chemistry in some ways and also due to just their limitations maybe as a team. But I think a lot of those are reasons as to why when you're looking at it, you're like, wow, like KD isn't getting those same looks. A lot of it goes to there's so much that goes behind it. A lot of it goes to Boston. A lot of it goes to the way their schemes are set up. And they just, as we could all definitely see, they just couldn't get it done.
Mark, you got anything to add to that? What stood out to you about that performance and the way Boston defended him?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I totally agree with what John's getting at. I think even with Harden in his diminished state, which that sounds like crazy to say about someone who's still playing at like an all-star level, like I think you just saw how much ball handling this team lacked. And I think that I don't want to say qualms with KD is totally the wrong way to put it, but just more like as good as Kyrie is, like to me, he's much more somebody I want playing as an off-ball scorer. Like he can obviously initiate some stuff for you, but I think ideally you have both those guys flowing off ball. Like Kyrie's one of the best off-ball movers in the NBA. Like he's so good as a cutter, he's an incredible shooter. But I mean, setting up and initiating the offense is not necessarily what I would consider makes him one of the better players in the NBA. And I think that's where you really see missing James Harden. And that's part of what made them so good last year when they were all together, because you were able to have James initiating everything. And even though he wasn't at full health, like just having somebody with gravity who could start things was huge. Like Goran Dragic was not doing that for you this year. Like you need somebody who has that kind of gravity without having to use a ball screen. Like he had some really nice moments in the playoffs, but no, it was not that guy. Patty Mills, more of a movement shooter, not really doing much in terms of running offense. Like any of the guards on this team. And what was so difficult too is they had to play small a lot too, because like I do think like there are some things you can look at like personnel wise that I would have maybe changed up, but like overall, I just don't really know what other answers they had in that series. Like they kind of just had to feed the ball through KD and hope that things loosened up. And like, obviously, there's Stan Van Gundy had of course he's never going to slander another coach, but he was totally right. Like Steve Nash did a lot to try and make things work. Of course, you can look and say, well, yes, it did not work. They get swept. But I do think part of that too is definitely on their roster limitations right now.
Mm-hmm.
You can look and say, well, theoretically Ben Simmons is helping some of that. I do have questions still, like what does that look like in the half court though? Like I do think that opens up a lot in transition, even though Brooklyn was pretty good in transition in this series. Like I felt like, a lot of their best looks, so like of course is coming out of early offense and in transition, but like it was when Brooklyn was able to get their defense set that they really started to struggle. And that's, kind of the sign of not being a great team. I mean, just honestly, it's just credit to Boston. Like to me, KD, this was the best passing season of his career, especially post All-Star break. Like it's not amazing technicality or anything, but the way that he was seeing the floor, he was constantly drawing to and being able to pick apart the defense and just being like probably having just about the best scoring gravity in the NBA and being able to take advantage of that routinely on a possession basis. Like that's insane compared to where he's been at in his career.
Mm-hmm.
But Boston was really able to play on that because of their role players. I mean, like they played a really interesting, like towing the line game of, okay, we're just going to help off of Bruce Brown, let him roam and float and do what he's going to do. And then we'll just get back onto him and hope that we're there with recovery and force him into tough shots. Because if he's like part of what's so difficult about being a Bruce Brown type player, the difference between shooting 50% and 40% on floaters is immense. Like it sounds minute, but like, and it's not even about points per possession. It's all about, like, to me, it's more, does the defense care? Like, if you're hitting every other floater, like, even if it's not quote unquote, like as efficient as being at the rim, like it's enough where like mentally as a defender, you're like, Jesus, this guy keeps hitting the shot right in front of me. And I don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
Because if you were just like 2 feet closer, I'm just going vertical. But like, if somebody's only shooting 40% on floaters, and we saw this with Bruce in the playoffs against Milwaukee, like he wasn't hitting well enough. And they got to a point where they're like, okay, take it. We're going to stay at the rim.
Mm-hmm.
But it was more about like just their bigs in general. Like they couldn't generate enough points offensively to be able to do things defensively. Like they were so small compared to Boston.
They were.
And I think that's where I really look at things in this coming summer is how they try and figure out their front court, because it is a mess right now. Like just an absolute mess right now.
It's in rough shape. You just touched on two of the needs that I highlighted for Brooklyn. One being the size and defense across the wing positions, and then also their general their depth. And you highlighted that talking about Boston. That was one of the big differences between the two teams. I mean, Boston had viable players at every position. They went legitimately 10 deep in that series. I mean, Williams stepped up and had great minutes. For them, you look at, Peyton Pritchard, had some great minutes for them, all the way down the line. I mean, there were contributors everywhere, and they weren't one-dimensional contributors the way that you would see, that work out for Brooklyn. There were multiple guys that can initiate the offense, multiple guys that can pick up and guard different positions, multiple guys that can go out here and get you a bucket, space the floor. So they had pretty much every base covered. And you go look at Brooklyn, it's like, oh, they can score. What else you got? And it was, it just kind of, they ran into a buzzsaw in that regard. But looking at their guards specifically, this is where I think they have problems, because Joe Harris didn't even appear in that series. He didn't play most of the year. You have him and Seth Curry, which it seems like that's kind of a redundancy in my eyes. And then they had Dragic playing a lot of minutes, Patty Mills, and then Kyrie. So you have a tons of guards, but where are you in terms of forwards? That's where they ran into trouble, because obviously Boston had a lot of great forwards, and that was on display throughout every game. So they're going to have to address that. But the problem is there's only so much money you can divvy out, especially when Kyrie plus KD plus Simmons are making $110 million between three players. And you look at the salary cap for next season, it's $122 million. So you're already up against the cap, and those are only 3 out of the 5 starters in your lineup, not to mention the bench and then, your additional rotation players. So they're just kind of in a rough spot in that regard. But I will say this, Bruce Brown earned himself a nice paycheck. He is an unrestricted free agent. The Nets have the rights to him. They have the full bird rights on him. But the problem is, I mean, they're already going to be in the tax territory. And if they extend him to a decent contract, I mean, they're going to be way up there, paying a massive tax bill after the season. So that's where it's tricky. And then one other thing I noticed was that their big men were not very viable in the playoffs. So Griffin got broken out towards the end, but he didn't give them all that much. LaMarcus Aldridge didn't really play. And Drummond had some good minutes, but I mean, still, he's going to get played off the court in certain moments. So it just seems like an inconsistent roster that was kind of up and down, and they had too many holes that got exploited there from that perspective. But just curious to see where they go from here with so much money tied up in just a few players, and then also some key players going into free agency. Claxton is a restricted free agent, and then Patty Mills has a player option. So we'll see where they go from here. But obviously, they have several glaring weaknesses in that lineup they have to address before next season.
Yeah, and what's so interesting too, like you mentioned, I do think that there is a little bit of redundancy with Joe and Seth Curry, but like I would always say, like, you can definitely, like, I think sometimes shooting can be overrated in the NBA, but when you have guys who are legitimate movement shooters, like that to me is not overrated. But what makes it difficult is, what other contract are you moving? Like, you have to move one of them, honestly, if you're making some kind of move. Like, it's just Seth is on I think he's just about the taxpayers mid-level, like $8.5 million. Joe is obviously I think he's like a $18.5 million cap hit next year. So like one of those guys, if you're trying, I mean, maybe even both to a degree, like you have to move one of them if you're making some sort of trade, which honestly, it's going to have to be trades with how they're making things work. Like, I don't think that, to me, like, I mean, I'd have to go through the free agency class again, but I don't think there's going to be any massive free agency signing that is totally swinging this for me. So yeah. And like, I mean, even looking at Nick Claxton as a free agent, like I don't know if like him and Joe Harris, I'm not sure we see them back next year. Like, I like Nick Claxton and who he can be. He struggled a little bit in the playoffs. I think part of it was just they needed too much out of him in some regards. But also, like, I mean, they were pretty willing to part with him at the trade deadline. And I'm interested to see what happens with that. Maybe there's some sort of sign and trade or something in those lines. But I mean, it becomes really interesting in looking at what do they get out of this past draft class too. Because I really like some of the moments we saw. Like, I think one of the ways that I could look, like, I wish Kessler Edwards had played more in this series.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
Just this year overall, I didn't love how his minutes were handled, but I also get it. Like, he's a rookie. He had ups and downs. They needed to be a title contending team. But I do think I would have liked to see him more and get more run in the postseason. Cam Thomas had a really up and down rookie year. I expect him to be better next year. Like, I liked a lot of his flashes, but also, like, I think he's somebody who's going to be able to handle the ball more for you than somebody like Patty Mills or Seth Curry, but also, like, he's not an awesome passer. Like, he can do some stuff in pick and roll. If the scoring is there, he adds an extra boost, which I think this team needs because they really lack shot creation in general outside of KD and Kyrie. But I do question, quite how much he's going to be able to handle next year. I'm not sure where I'm at with that. And then, like, I love Daron Sharp. Like, I think he's somebody I'm really interested in. But even then, he is another limited big. Like, I do think there are moments where he was probably the best screener on the team this year, which says, I mean, it's good about him, but also, like, that tells you kind of where they were at as a team this year in their front court. I really like a lot of things that he could bring as, he's already the best short roll passer on the team without having played like 500 minutes for them this year. He's just a very good, high IQ center with some interesting defensive chops too, but like very below the rim athlete. And I think we already saw that play kind of an issue for him. I mean, it was an issue for him at times at UNC. I think that it's only going to be a little bit more in the NBA. Like, I'm not trying to totally undersell who he can be. I like him a lot, but I think, again, looking at him to be an answer in the front court next year outside of being like a backup for 10 to 15 minutes, I'm not sure how far I can get there with that. So yeah, they have a lot to figure out in the offseason.
They absolutely do. I mean, we can go probably an hour straight on the Nets because there's so much to unpack with them, both from an on-court perspective as well as their cap sheets. But I think it's safe to say that they have some work to do, and we'll see if KD and Kyrie can make anything of this time that they've really invested in this team. I guess one other thing I did want to touch on, I mean, of course, Kyrie does have a player option. So, I mean, that's a big question with this team. John, if you're looking at this team and you're a GM and you're trying to kind of figure out what Kyrie may do next. I mean, I think first off, it's just clear that there's no telling what Kyrie's going to do. He's just one of those guys that you just kind of have to roll the dice and you just kind of have to hope for the best. But Brooklyn does have an edge in terms of the money they can offer him, $247 million versus $183 from another team. So we'll see what happens with that. But, any thoughts on what Kyrie may do, with just keeping in mind that he might go in just the complete opposite direction because he's Kyrie Irving?
I was about to say, like, even God has no idea what Kyrie Irving's about to do. Absolutely no clue. But look, that's a big, in terms of looking at the salary cap numbers, like that's a huge advantage the Nets have over anybody else. I think this team probably will, like, in terms of like KD signing on for long term, Kyrie obviously has that option. Like they'll probably take those options and right. When I'm saying probably, like, as if like that's the sensible thing maybe that they would probably want to do, but that doesn't mean that that's what they're going to do. Like I definitely can't even begin to think about what they will do. But if you're the GM and you kind of have to ride this thing out, there's really no way you can in any way not go all in because you've gone this far going all in. Like there's no way you can give up all your when you count the pick swaps, basically giving up all your first round picks going forward and say, you know what, like let's not go. Let's go like 95% in. Like at this point, you have to go 100%. Completely all in. So that's kind of what they're going to have to do to make this work.
100%. Well, guys, I mean, we are in the midst of the playoffs, so I feel like it's only right that we start to dive into the series that are currently ongoing. We have a few series here that looks like they're going to come down to the wire. They're going to go at least 6 games, maybe even 7. The first of which being the Sixers-Raptors series. That one is shaping up to be a really good contest. Doc Rivers' legacy is on the line in the series, being up 3-1 and, looking at now it's 3-2 after being up 3-0, having 2 closeout games that didn't quite go his way. The big story in this series has been Embiid. He's hampered by that which looks to be a torn ligament in his finger that will be addressed at the end of the season. But it looks like that the Raptors are starting to target him a little bit more, and Embiid is getting worn down by having to, assume a bigger role defensively. And, that's a weak point that kudos to the Raptors. They're definitely exploiting that, and they're getting a little bit healthier. Van Vliet is questionable, I believe. Scotty Barnes, credit to him. He's toughing out these minutes with an ankle that's less than 100%. But this is one of the more interesting series because, as we saw right before the playoffs, Toronto is not afraid of what Philly brings to the table, what Embiid brings to the table. It looked like it was going to be a quick series here for a minute, but obviously that hasn't been the case. So, going into Game 6, Mark, what do you think the Philly needs to do to get back on track and to avoid going into a Game 7? That would give the Raptors an opportunity to climb back from that 3-0 deficit.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think getting Tyrese Maxey going would be huge for them. He has really struggled the last couple games, which has factored in heavily for them, in my opinion. Like, I mean, Joel's being double and triple teamed every time down court. Yes, he's not hitting shots, and I'm not sure what that's going to look like for him the rest of the series, just given the nature of his injury. But also, like, they need other guys to factor in. Like, I think they really need to find other ways to get James going towards the rim. Like, the switching has really neutralized his ability to get downhill, and not just switching, but switching with size, like having a lot out there. Like, if Khem Birch is out on the court, they need to automatically get him involved. But also, Khem Birch played out I think 11 minutes in the last game, so they're pretty much limiting. I mean, the Raptors are limiting the opportunity to really take advantage of that. I will say too, like, Joel played the worst defensive game I think I've seen from him in a month or two in this last game. Like, he just looked gassed the entire game. He wasn't making some of the rotations he normally will. Overall, just didn't look like himself. So I think, like, those are easy things that I can just be like, well, if Joel Embiid plays like 80% of Joel Embiid, then I would have a lot more faith in them. But I mean, they're also just at the stage too where it's like, I don't know entirely. Like, do you try and really toy with what you're doing and get aggressive and be like, we have to take Game 6 because then, like, it sounds like a minute thing, like, oh, we're putting pressure on ourselves, so we got to win here. But, like, that really does factor in. Like, that can actually be a thing. And if you do get in your heads, like, it very much has felt like it in the last, especially not even the game 4, not as much, but like game 5, I mean, that team looked like a shell of themselves as it went on. I mean, you saw Danny Green speaking to the press today, and like again, I don't want to take too much from a press conference, but he did not sound confident going into game 6. Like this team is definitely in a place where like they know, I mean, they're on Twitter. Like guys check Twitter way more than I think the average fan realizes. Like they know what is up. They do not want to lose game 6 because I cannot even imagine what the hell it'll be like if a game 7 happens. I mean, it sounds minute, but again, just like they have to make shots. Like they have to get everyone else going, and it's a lot less on Embiid to me than anyone else. But yeah, it's really gross series for them with how this has gone, especially with how the first 3 games looked. But yeah, man, that's kind of where I'm at with it right now.
That's what I've noticed as well. Just looking at the contributions from the Sixers bench in that last game compared to the Raptors bench. I mean, the Raptors are getting great contributions from Precious Achiuwa and Boucher. Chris Boucher, I mean, the dude is it's an interesting character. He was on my I have a soft spot for him because he really helped me out in fantasy last year. He kind of came out of nowhere and made some noise. But from that slingshot jumper to his endless energy, you know, he's a guy that you throw out there for 17, 18 minutes a game and get good energy from. You know, he's going to do something. You don't know if it's going to be exactly great.
It's very chaotic, yeah.
Exactly, yep. And that's better than what a lot of guys, you know, will do, you know, on the court where they just kind of come up empty. But they definitely need more contributions. I think the Sixers, you know, from that bench unit. I think the starters are getting taxed. You know, you talked about Embiid just kind of being in that position where he looked gassed the whole game. And that's definitely not a spot where you want to be in. You know, those guys are playing 40-plus minutes. And, I mean, the Raptors are playing a lot of minutes too. They definitely have to, but they just look fresher. And it looks like they're kind of pouncing on the Sixers and really giving a run for their money. So, yeah, I think going into game 6 is going to be a huge game. You know, of course, it's not the clincher for the Raptors, but in some ways it kind of feels like it is because, you know, if it goes game 7 and, you know, I guess Philly just doesn't want to be in that position. I know Doc doesn't want to be in that position. He's getting flashbacks, not the good kind. So they definitely need to kind of take advantage of that series while they can and just kind of put Toronto away. I think is the big takeaway from that one. But moving along to another series that you know I think is arguably the best one so far in round 1, Grizzlies Timberwolves has been an absolute treat. I've absolutely loved every game that I've watched so far for that series. Just you know, from the contributions of John Morant, you know, one of the best players in the league, you know, all the way across that Memphis roster, which has been very impressive. The Timberwolves, you know, the same thing. You know, Cat has had his ups and downs, but he's really come through in a big way. You know, looking at this series, you know, looking all the way up across the roster, I mean, there are some great players on both sides. And one theme that I see coming up again and again in the discourse of this series is that these are two teams, they're very young. And you can see that when you watch them play. They make mistakes. They rush into things. They kind of get away from the game plan, which results in huge runs. But I don't know if there have been 2 more entertaining teams in this series or in these playoffs so far. You guys kind of feel like that's a accurate statement?
I've seen that John Morant dunk like 100 times this morning.
I'm
walking around the studios and stuff, and it's just on repeat on ESPN, whatever channel I'm looking at. That dunk is on, and it is. I honestly, I'm not mad about that. I'm not mad about that one bit.
Yeah, it was that was amazing. I wrote about it this morning because I couldn't stop thinking about it last night. Like I thought it was. I went back and I was looking through. I'm like, yeah, that's one of the 10 best dunks in the playoffs of all time. Like it's up there in terms of just like actual implications, like actually how it went down. It's there for sure. Just in terms of this, like you mentioned, age. I was checking this morning, and according to Real GM, the Grizz are the 2nd youngest team in the NBA by average age, and the Wolves are the 7th youngest team by average age. So yeah, it's like, and it's like you mentioned, like yesterday, I think was like the encapsulating game of just how young these teams are. Like very erratic. Like both teams have had playoff experience. Like obviously not everyone on the Wolves has. Like I mean, D'Lo and Cat have, but like the Grizz were in a pretty solid playoff series last year against Utah. Got their you know, teeth sank in a little bit and got some experience, but you still see it play out on court a lot. I think the pace has felt completely different in every single game. Like we had that first game where it was like, it felt like an 80s Nuggets game watching them. It was insane. I have no idea how they did that for an entire game, but then we had like a grind fest, and then we got back to like more erratic play yesterday that kind of slowed down a little bit as the game went on. But I think, like you mentioned, we see it. I don't want to just break it down to like what's wrong with each team or anything, or what has really kind of halted them. But I think, like you mentioned, with the Wolves, I think we see some issues with decision making that I really want to, like, I think in some ways, you can see the real missing a true like front court partner with Cat, in my opinion. Like, I love Jared Vanderbilt. I think he's a really good player, but I do think too, like he needs to be able to do just like 10-15% more on offense to be a little bit more viable as a starter right now. Like, he's not super, like, he's capable of making some solid kick out passes on the short roll and being like kind of, again, like in that same Bruce Brown mold, but also they need more than that. And you've seen, like, they've done a really good job. Chris Finch and his staff have done a really good job starting to counter that. Like, I want to say it was game 4 where they started putting Jared Vanderbilt in an empty corner in the dunker spot and having him cheat in as, you know, like to make the tagger just have to be like, okay, well, either I'm taking away Cat's drive or Cat's stumping off. And like they've done things to make it work, but I do think it's been a lot harder on the offense. But then Memphis has been, and this is one of the things I was concerned about coming in, and especially headed into the next series, like their shooting outside of Desmond Bane is a real concern. Like, they have a lot of guys who are willing shooters, but not a lot of guys who are good willing shooters, which is a problem. Like, I expect Dillon Brooks to be better moving forward, just we've seen him play well in the playoffs before, and we know, you know, he's better than shooting 35% from the field and like below 30% from 3. But right now, if I remember correctly, like, I have to check really quick, but I believe Desmond Bane is the only player shooting above league average from 3 in their playoff series right now, which is like not good. And it really shows up too. Like, Jaren has struggled with the foul trouble, and, you know, just not being able to get his offense going in any way, shape, or form because of that too. Like, the Wolves have played really well on him, to give them credit, but like, he's only playing about 23-24 minutes per game in the series. Luckily, Brandon Clark has been awesome, which has been good for them. But yeah, I mean, you just see in some ways both these teams really are able to expose one another's weaknesses at their fullest degree, which is kind of like, you don't always see that play out in the playoffs. So that's kind of what, to me, has made it so interesting, but also like it feels like watching a college game at times.
That's a good way to put it. Man, don't get me started on Jaren Jackson. me and John actually talked about him a little bit briefly in our last podcast, and I actually just posted a clip to YouTube earlier today. I talked about the same thing you were talking about. He can't play more than 24 minutes a game because he fouls out every game. He's averaging 5 fouls a game for the playoffs so far. And, you know, every year of his career, he's consistently at 3+ fouls a game, which is it's insane. You know, you want your starter to be out there at least 30 minutes, in the low 30s, and he can't even eclipse that. So that's a huge hindrance for them on both ends. You know, you don't have that spacing, and then you don't have that ability to kind of switch out and, you know, protect the rim a little bit there on defense. So it's definitely a tough thing to see. But I do want to leave us with this as far as this team or this series. You know, Brandon Clark, I don't think gets enough credit as a player. You know, looking at his performance from the last game, he was everywhere. You know, he finished with you know, a pretty solid stat line of 15 points. You know, in that game, let's see, was this the last game they played? Or maybe I'm looking at a different one. But I know he had a double-double in their last game. You know, he's very, very solid. So, you know, as a guy that you can count on to go in there, and he doesn't have the offensive ceiling of a guy like Jaren Jackson necessarily, but just somebody that you know exactly what you're going to get from him every night. I think he deserves a ton of credit. And I think that goes back to Memphis and the way they've drafted in the late first round here over the last few years. They nail those picks. That front office is excellent, and it really pays dividends in the playoffs because you can't always count on your stars to be 100% every night. Sometimes you need a little bit more when it comes to the bench. So he's really stepped up in a big way, and I think he deserves a lot of credit, as well as the other bench guys for Memphis, you know, the way they've stepped up their games. So if we're good on that series, guys, let's move right along. Suns Pelicans has been a thriller as well. And, you know, again, it's a 3-2 lead this time for Phoenix. So they're looking to close this one out in their next game. But, I mean, CP3 has had a lot on his shoulders in the absence of Devin Booker, which it just got reported today that Devin Booker may be approaching a return, which is good to see. But in the meantime, I mean, they're assuming he's going to be out, so Chris Paul is definitely going to have to assume more of a role in that offense. But Mikal Bridges is out in full force. We saw that last game. Very impressive showing from him, over 30 points in that game. And he continued to do what he does so well, which is just be a great cutter, great in transition, a great shooter. And that contract extension that he got, last offseason is looking pretty good right now. So happy for Mikal, happy for what he's able to bring to this team. And I love the Pelicans. I mean, is there a team that's going to defy expectations more than the Pelicans here so far in the playoffs? If, John, what do you think about that? The Pelicans, are they the biggest kind of surprise to you in the playoffs here so far?
I would say so. I'm trying to think of other teams. I don't think anyone and it's not so much even their seeding being an 8 seed going against the team with the best record in the league. It's not even like those numbers are kind of irrelevant in that. It's just more so like they've been marred with so much like it seems like dysfunction, but they're getting through it. Like with everything going on with Zion and stuff, it seems like okay, like everything's a mess over there in New Orleans, and the team's not playing that at all. Maybe that's what we think about them. Maybe that's what media thinks about them. Maybe that's what it looks like with one player who obviously gets a lot of attention. But other than that, like the rest of the guys there are playing like. Okay, we're out here playing basketball. We have a lot of guys that are really talented. Like people forget how good some of these guys are, like Brandon Ingram, and they're out there just balling out, and it's working for them. And they were able to win 2 games against a team that was obviously heavily favored over them, and they've been close in almost all of them. And it's going to be a really fun series going down to the wire. This game 6 is going to be fun because obviously there's a good amount of pressure on Phoenix. Nothing compared to the pressure on Philly in that other series that we were just talking about a little while ago. But still some pressure. And the Pelicans, right, they're not supposed to be here. Like, obviously, when you're a playing team and you're going through all that, that's obviously right. You're still defying expectations, but they're a team that definitely. Is doing something that no one really expected them to do, and they're playing with house money right now. I think Bo, when he was talking about UNC, he called it. I'm trying to think of what Bo called it. He was talking about playing with everything from here is gravy. That's what he was saying with UNC.
Oh yeah.
It's just all gravy from here. For New Orleans, it's kind of what they have going for them. It's just all gravy from here.
100%. So looking at what these teams have been doing so far, I think. One of the big things that stands out to me from the Pelicans side is, what they have, and this is getting into the offseason. I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here, but like what they have to look forward to going into the future. Herb Jones, Alvarado, two of the big players for them that have been huge contributors. Najee Marshall was a huge story last season, and he's been almost like phased out entirely of the rotation. You go across the lineup. There's just great contributors all around. So, I think that's an aspect of this that's lost on some people. The fact that the Pelicans have a great foundation here, and if Zion can return next season to this iteration of this team, then that's a huge, huge bonus. And they could really make some noise. They could make maybe not to the same degree, but a similar leap to what we saw from Memphis this past season in terms of just going from a borderline playoff team to a team that's really kind of in the thick of the playoff race and really make some noise. How do you feel about that, Mark, if we're kind of trying to look forward to like what this team could be, whether or not they win this series, against a team that they looked like on paper they were going to be vastly outmatched and maybe even swept?
Yeah. I think, to me, I looked at this team before we knew Zion was going to be out, and it was reported that he was going to be back, for like the first week of the season. And not miss any games. Like I looked at this team as like I think that they have a chance to be a locked playoff team, like maybe the 5 or 6 seed if things really hit right. Obviously that didn't happen, but I think more importantly is what did happen. Obviously they had the really rough start, 3-16 to start the year, but then things clicked. They found their way, and most impressively is how they got there. Sometimes I think culture can be really cliche and often misplaced when talking about the NBA. What Willie Green has done this year has been like legit. That has been very real in terms of what they've done in building a culture and foundation there. In some ways, obviously, similarly to what happened in Phoenix, where he came from. I think Brandon Ingram's growth has been tremendous. And we've seen it in the playoffs. I think he's putting up 28, 6 and 5 right now. He's made real strides as a passer this year. I think his decision making's gotten better. He's become, he's continuing to become the efficient player that he was, on prior years and building off of that. Jonas Valanciunas really worked for them. I'm just so interested to see what Zion can look like with this. Like I love CJ's addition. He hasn't shot incredibly well in the playoffs, but I still think you totally see the vision of what he's doing. And I just didn't like, I'm like, okay, if he has somebody like Zion to play off of, like that, it's only even better. Obviously, I mean, there's going to be growing pains adding in somebody with that much usage who's a different player to it. But I also think like I'm very intrigued by it. The biggest thing I'm looking at though is what happens with Devontae Graham and trying to fill in that backup situation because that's the only thing that I'm really concerned by with them. And we've seen that in these games. They really, especially yesterday, like they are struggling to get the ball up court and get initiated in their sets. I think a lot of that is because of their lack of ball handling outside of CJ. Like obviously Brandon can do stuff, but like ideally, I think Brandon is, not always having to initiate sets for you. And I mean, same thing with CJ. Like CJ is a really good off-ball player. Obviously, he's very good as a pick and roll operator too. But again, like I think when they had Devontae in there yesterday, it didn't feel like they could get any kind of downhill momentum. Like he's not that type of player, but also
not at all.
Like if your backup point guard or six man cannot handle traps and getting the ball out, like that's a problem. And that was a problem for them all year. And even then, like his shot really wasn't there. He's not able to do much inside the arc. I'm not trying to slander the man. I still think he has he's an NBA player. But I'm curious to see if they wait and see like, okay, can this work if Zion is back? I personally am kind of in the camp of I would rather, try and change things up because even then, like you're still relying a lot on him just being hot from deep and being able to open things up like that. But that's, I think that has definitely been highlighted, in a low light way during the playoffs for sure.
Yeah, he's been a very big disappointment. I mean, I drafted him in fantasy and maybe the 5th or 6th round, and I regretted it immediately. I waited and waited for him to make his impact, and it never came. I mean, he got demoted to a bench role, and he hasn't really been much better in that role. So it's unfortunate because he was one of their highlighted free agency signings last offseason, and that just went off the rails. Definitely looks like a poor move on their part. And like you said, I mean, he doesn't operate within the arc whatsoever. I mean, if he's not hitting his threes, what is he really contributing to your team, even in a bench role? It's definitely tough. But in any case, I mean, this series is going 6, and the Pelicans are back at home, so we'll see if they can make a stand there. But Grand Theft Alvarado all day. That's all I got to say about that. I think
I'm right there with you.
Yes, sir. Let's end it on that note. One last series here, guys, as we kind of round home base on this one. Jazz Mavericks has been quite the treat. Luka made his return a couple of games ago. He's been spectacular. He hasn't missed a beat. He's been doing what he's been doing for, his entire career, which is just being a bully inside, using a 6'7" frame to get good shots. That step back three is as deadly as ever, making great plays, passes to his teammates. And then conversely for the Jazz, it's kind of more of the same. They found themselves in a 3-2 hole. This could be the end of the Jazz as we know them, this current iteration. Mike Conley hasn't been there to kind of step up his offensive game to kind of assist Donovan in that regard. Gobert is Gobert. I mean, he does what he does. He's still a great player. But, you look across the roster and it's just kind of like, they're really good, but don't see them as being a team that's able to kind of carry themselves to the next level, to a conference finals appearance, to a finals appearance. It just kind of seems like this team has run the course. And it's kind of really sad to see that. You see teams, throughout the years in the NBA come together and they're a really solid unit, maybe even win a lot of regular season games. But when it comes to the playoffs, and in the Jazz's case, defensively, perimeter defense is just something that they struggle with. And they've gotten carved up. They ran into Dallas, which is, not doing them any favors, hitting a lot of their open threes. But, it's just a tough sledding for the Jazz right now. So, Mark, do you feel like this is kind of like the end of the line as it pertains to this iteration of the Jazz, like with Conley, Bogdanovich, Gobert? I mean, could these guys be on their way out if they flame on the first round again?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I believe Tim McMahon from ESPN, said on the low post pod before the postseason even started. He's like, if this is a team that like doesn't make the conference finals, like I think that there's major changes happening. And It's tough just because, like I think this is, again, like if you're backing up 2 years and this is where it's happening, like that's one thing, but this is, third straight year where they're really having struggles. I think what's so difficult too is that you can tell like a lot of this isn't it. Yes, the perimeter defense sucks, but also like it's why it sucks. Like there's just straight up non-effort at times, which is like the saying disturbing sounds like way too much for talking about a sport, but like that. I mean, I want to say it was game 3, the game where the Jazz did come back and win, or it might have been game 4. I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but point being, like the Jazz were just like, I mean, Donovan Mitchell's just like giving up whiffs at the point of attack to Jalen Brunson. And then they pull Rudy Gobert and go small to come out and crawl back out of that lead. I mean, crawl back and come back from behind and win that game. And like Donovan's playing his ass off at the point of attack and like playing pretty solid defense. Like honestly too, like game 2, I thought he played pretty well defensively. It was one of the better defensive games he'd had in a while, but also like the bar is low. And it is an effort thing to me. Like there are definitely moments too. Like yes, Bojan is not a great perimeter defender. Mike is super limited now. I think that's something that got kind of underrated this year. Like he really lost a step on both ends, and it showed up on defense quite a bit. And yeah, like the size is definitely an issue, but it's just like the communication is not there. You can tell they don't have what they did last year, even like the year before. Like they don't have that same togetherness. Is just it sounds really cliche and annoying, but like it shows. Like it just shows that they are not there together. So like regardless of who goes, I mean this is not just a 1 or 2 starters. Like this is like, I feel like this is very much like a blowing up the entire team to an extent. Right. I mean, I'm curious what that'll look like in Utah, considering they don't really have a history of being a losing team other than like the years before the Gordon Hayward years. But then after that, like, I mean, they made the playoffs, like 5 or 6 straight seasons, and they were not interested in tearing it down. So I don't know. I don't really know what the answer is, but change is definitely on the horizon for this group.
John, are you in agreement with that? Is this kind of the end for these guys?
It's what it seems like. I mean, whether it's the rumors going around as to where some of their star players are going to go. I mean, what it looks like in terms. Like, there's always. I mean, everyone's made such a big deal about the stat about Donovan Mitchell not passing Rudy Gobert the ball like at all, like ever. And I think it's kind of been a little bit overblown in terms of like the way people are perceiving it. But it's just things like that are kind of always a recurring thing on top of their lackluster performance in the basketball court. Or, obviously leaving much to be desired compared to their regular season total or win totals, whatever that might be. There's obviously a lot that everyone's expecting out of them that they're not living up to. And when it happens once or twice, that's one thing. But when you're seeing it 3+ years in a row, like that's when it starts to be like, okay, like what's the ceiling here? What like how many more years of this can we have? Because at a certain point, you like every team's always slow to blow it up. Like everyone is going to be late to blowing it up. But at this point now, everything kind of points to where that's the only kind of logical option here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you guys. It looks like it's kind of the end of the road for the Jazz, and it looks like it was almost like Game 5 was just like everything about that team that they've struggled with, and just the expectations just really hit them to the point where they couldn't even, make open 3. I mean, they went 3 for 30 from 3 in that last game, which I'm still just kind of trying to wrap my head around. You take 30, you make 3. It's no wonder they only generated 77 points. That's one of the most 3-point happy teams in the league. And they hit at a pretty high clip usually, but obviously in that last game, it just wasn't meant to be. And as we wander our conversation today, I mean, this thing keeps coming up in my head, and I see pieces about it all the time. Depth in the playoffs really, truly matters. You got to have the stars, obviously, but you got to have those guys on the back end to step up. I mean, you go and look at the conversations about Dallas. Who do you keep seeing? You keep seeing Maxi Kleber stepping up. You keep seeing Dorian Finney-Smith stepping up. You keep seeing Jalen Brunson. John and I discussed him on our last podcast as well. The fact that he's going to get a nice check after the season is over for his contributions. But then you go and look at the Jazz side, and it's like, okay, House gives them some decent minutes. I mean, Jordan Clarkson, has some moments. But does Hernangomez really give them much? Does Whiteside come in and really is he really a game changer? Alexander Walker hardly plays, so it's just tough for them. It's tough for any team if you go into the playoffs and you don't have your 7th, 8th, 9th guys producing, and then you have your stars struggle. Like you have a game like they did in Game 5 where no one can hit threes. You're just kind of in a situation where you're just kind of you're just kind of out of luck, to kind of put it plainly. So definitely a shame on that front. But guys, as we wrap up our conversation today, I mean, we always like to highlight this as we come to, come to the conclusion. We always want to highlight Sports Business Classroom. Me and Mark were, in the same class. We went through this program and we experienced what this can provide to people looking for a career in basketball. John, same thing. He went through it, knows what they can provide. And they're going to be back at it this summer. Back in, this July, Sports Business Classroom is back in Vegas. Me and John will be on site. Mark, I'm not sure if you'll be in Vegas, but I would love to see you there if you could make it out this summer. But in any case, Sports Business Classroom is back on for this summer. It's in person once again for the second year in a row, and it's a great experience. So we all can kind of advocate for this program and say that it's a great experience. So if you guys are just looking for an opportunity to get your foot in the door, I mean, I don't think there's a better place to start. Go ahead and check out their website for more information, and they'll definitely be able to kind of help you guys with whatever you're looking for. So John, Mark, I think this is a good time to conclude our conversation, but always a great time. John, always love to have this time to kind of collaborate with you and have some great, basketball talk. Mark, again, congrats on the great work, and, hope to be able to continue to kind of catch up with you and keep tabs of what you're doing. And the best of luck with what you have going on there at Basketball News. It's really exciting to see.
Appreciate that a ton, man. And yeah, I should be in Vegas. I have to actually set up plans to get out there. But yeah, no, I'll be out there, man. So we'll keep in touch for sure.
Sounds good. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for checking out this episode of the pod. Of course, we'll be back here real soon with more content as it pertains to the playoffs and the offseason, and even the draft as it comes closer here day by day. So enjoy the rest of these playoffs here. Enjoy these games coming up, and we'll see you here on the next installment of the pod. Take care.